Hey, welcome back, everybody. We got an exciting one today. We are talking about Bookman and the events that occurred with him in chapter 257 and what kind of led up to why Bookman made the choices he did at this point in the story. But before any of that, just want to make sure that everyone's aware this will include spoilers from chapter 257. I also want to say that anybody who has watched my 257 review, I apologize for calling the Desire Noah, whose name is apparently Cheryl Carlton, like 50 times in there. I was seemingly confusing it with Camelot, which doesn't even make sense because Road also has Camelot, so it's a multiple person last name. So I appreciate anybody who stuck through with that, and nobody really made that big of a deal about it in the comments. So thank you for that as well. Also, I guess, want to thank everybody. We officially passed 50 subscribers, which is a huge landmark for the channel because I know how infrequently I post and appreciate all that everybody has done to support me in my endeavors to just kind of talk about D.Gray Man a bit. So, with all that said, I think it's time to start talking about the topic at hand. And I think the best way to start talking about this is what led Bookman up to this choice. Because we definitely know that Bookman, at the point in the story we were at, is a lot different than how he is at the beginning, or even like technically the first time we see him in timeline continuity and not in story continuity. Because we get to see a lot more about Bookman's personality through the previous Lavi's backstory with Alan before the Apocryphus fight and being remade. So what's interesting is when we first kind of have the conversation with the other Lavi in chapter 252, he mentions that he finds like a kinship in Noah because they are both trying to find like the meaning of their existence. All that Bookman Jr. did at that moment was record and stay on the sidelines. And that is seemingly how Bookman wanted to be. He is a recorder, he's impartial. That is literally a whole plot with current Lavi when they go to the Noah's Ark, and Road is like, you have become biased. You are no longer a good bookman. And for Lavi and kind of current bookmen, their definition of unbiased, impartial has changed from what it was potentially with Bookman before we see him in the story and see him before even like early time of Lavi, the previous Bookman Jr., talking. So essentially, he is like, I know the truth, and I just have to stay on the sideline. I can't do anything, and I want to help out, which is why he ultimately decides to team up with Alan and Naya, which separates him away from Bookman. And this probably starts to spark the change in Bookman's character, where, again, this is fully off screen, and I'm just taking this from how I'm reading the story. If you have a different opinion, feel free to say that. I'm not saying mine is necessarily correct, and I'd love to hear any of yours as well. But essentially, when this happens, we know that there were unresolved feelings between the previous Bookman Jr. and Bookman. So when he merges with Alan and becomes the the ball of Helix energy for 7 years, Bookman has some time to reflect, as well as this happened post the 35 years ago battle between Naya and unaliving all of the Noah except for the Earl and Road. So we don't know if potentially his riff with the Noah happened at that point, or if it potentially happens here where it might be some spite over Bookman Jr. leaving, or maybe him realizing some factors of like why it's so bad to be so impartial that he is. So when we officially meet Bookman and the current Lavi in the story, they both are exorcists now. They both use innocence, which is a whole nother conversation of the fact that like they were able to have like a good relationship with the Noah despite not having innocence. So they have like their own fighting style, which I kind of brought up a bit when Lucia defeats the Golem, but we haven't seen enough of it to really justify or how well it would work against either innocence or the Noah's power. So you can take that here or there, but they essentially are like, we're still impartial, but we're currently at least siding with the Order and Innocence rather than with the Noah, which is a big change, as we know, because in chapter 207, the Noah mentioned that they did have that good relationship with each other, at least like serviceable, like they do trades, and they'd essentially allow the Bookmen to do what they must. And even in the current story, when Cheryl, the Desire Noah, is like hurting Lavi drastically in the most recent chapter, the other Noah are kind of warning him, like, we don't want to do this. The Bookmen have an importance that cannot be understated. We cannot just kill them off. So obviously Cheryl's mad because of the whole road stuff, but it shows like the importance of the Bookman, and the fact that Bookman is even willing to side with one of these two sides in this massive story shows that he's changed at least a little bit from being the fully impartial side judge that he was. He fights Akuma, he does all this stuff, and we kind of see that like Lavi, the current one, kind of grows up a lot more differently. He feels like he has more freedom. And Bookman, who treated the previous Bookman Jr. as his son, kind of sees Lavi as his grandson. So when we get to this chapter and Lavi is kind of trying to sacrifice himself so that Bookman can escape, because he kind of feels like Bookman is what a Bookman should be. And even though he thinks like he's a okay Bookman Jr., he doesn't think he lives up to Bookman's status. He's like, Bookman, get out of here. I'll create an opening for you where, because this is so important, as once again, going back to 207, 50 chapters before this moment, Bookman in his own head is like, Apocryphus is chasing after Alan. Alan has left the Order. We're hitting like the climax of the story, and this is this part of the story that the Bookmen have to record. They've been recording these wars that have been going on forever, and this moment with Alan, the destroyer of time, probably is the moment where history of the Bookmen is finally completed, and this holy war might be over. And he's like, this is what we need to be recording. So this is a big moment for Bookman, and like obviously he wants to live through to see the end of this story. But he's like, I cannot sacrifice another one. I was probably too hard on the previous Bookman Jr. and pushed him away, which led him to join with Nea and eventually led to his death, which Bookman assumedly mourns. And now he's seeing his other successor. And obviously, like, you can make the argument that maybe he's doing it as a cold judgment factor of he doesn't have the time left in his lifespan to survive another training of a Bookman Jr., because there can only be two at one time, a Bookman and a Junior. When one of them dies, the Junior simply becomes a Bookman, and the new Bookman Jr. is born at some point in the world. So you could argue it's the cold calculating side, but it clearly isn't meant to be read that way from my understanding. And he goes on to be like, you don't understand anything of this world. And like with the questions that you're asking me, and this is to the Noah, you don't understand the basis of what you're asking. So even if I told you the answers, you wouldn't understand. And he decides right then and there, I kind of have this Wisely card, which I'm sure we'll get more development on at a future moment, where Wisely probably has some history with the Bookmen, more so than any other Noah. And is like, when I'm about to die, then Wisely is clearly not going to let both Bookmen die. He understands our importance to the world. So he uses the inheritance ceremony, which seems to be like cutting into yourself. He bites into his hand. And then because Bookmen kind of transfer knowledge through blood, creates like this orb of blood that probably has all the knowledge that he has that the current Lavi doesn't, and then sends it into him, which causes Lavi to now officially become the Bookman, and Bookman's life as Bookman is over. I do not, because obviously Bookman dies right after this moment, we don't understand like the impact of this. Would this occur assuming Bookman were to do this and then they both were able to escape? Would that make Bookman just a normal human, and then a new Bookman Jr. might come at a future point? Or does that just mean there are two people who are officially known as Bookman, and Bookman is more of a title up between the two rather than anything else? Questions that I feel like probably won't be answered because it just won't come up again in the story. But he essentially realizes here that like the way he lived might not have been the right way for a bookman to be, and it's the way that he probably grew up on with the previous bookman being fully impartial, and seeing like his two successors the way they were ends up making him decide to go the route that he does. And we don't know if he would have done this either way, but I definitely think it's kind of cool that Bookman, despite not being so much in the story from like his own backstory, kind of gets so much development based on off-screen implication, which is such an interesting way that a lot of stories don't really do. A lot of stories kind of have a show and tell situation rather than imply. And once again, I could be barking up the wrong tree. That's what's great about stories like this, where people can read it multiple ways. But I like to see just how much Bookman has kind of changed as a person. And yeah, like I said, kind of short and sweet. I think there's a whole nother conversation about what the inheritance technically means and what information that Bookman has. Maybe I'll try to do it. I know I'm not the greatest with upload consistency or as well as editing. But if you enjoyed this kind of short video on like the evolution of Bookman, let me know, comment, subscribe. Let me know if you think that my interpretation of Bookman's story is not the way you interpreted it. I'm happy to hear other people's opinion, and like mine could be wrong sometimes. Evident by me saying that Cheryl was Carlton for like 12 minutes of my last review. So if you stayed till the end, please like, comment, subscribe. Appreciate you, and bye.